the next thing on the program is a panel led by Greg Sadler on Stoicism in prisons. So he'll introduce the members of the panel, but I'll just name them. It's Robert S. Colter, Santara Gonzales, Bob Robinson, and Andrew Small. Thank you.
All right, so we're waiting for all of our panel members to come up and get ready to field questions and have conversation. So while we're doing that, I'll just talk a little bit about the idea behind the panel and why we wanted to do this. The theme of cosmopolitanism, we've already seen this touched on a little bit. We want to think about people who often we don't think about. And in our societies in the present, we hide inmates or prisoners away. I remember when I was a student down in graduate school in Southern Illinois, which used to be a coal-producing region. At that time, the big industry was prisons. And the state of Illinois was building lots of them. And it was a, sort of not very well populated area. People were happy to work in the prisons because it was a source of income. And it was a way to essentially hide people away. The majority of the prisoners were coming from upstate, and they were way down in the South, and they could be forgotten about, essentially. So, the idea of talking to people who have not only worked in prisons, but worked in prisons specifically in terms of education, and not just education, like helping people get their GREs or things like that, or learn, valuable skills like culinary arts or HVAC, but to engage in transformative education that plays a part in moral reformation. I thought that could make for a really good panel. And there's nothing like talking with people who don't just have an academic background, but have actually been walking the walk to find out what things are like. And I think we'll find out, the experiences of prisons incredibly varied. Just here in the United States, every single Department of Corrections is different than the other. Every prison is different than the other. We also have something like 20,000 different county jail systems, some of which are larger than some state prison systems. And that's just the US. If we talk about Canada, we talk about Great Britain, we talk about all sorts of other places, it can be quite different. So I thought a panel on Stoicism, prison education could be quite valuable for all of us. And we've got a great lineup of experts here that I see. I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. So we have Bob Robinson, who has a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University. He was hired by New Mexico Corrections to teach philosophy courses, and then began teaching Stoicism in maximum and medium security male and female prisons, and began administering reentry programs statewide. Now he teaches a honors college course, Prison and the Good Life at University of New Mexico, which not only explains New Mexico prison culture and effective correctional programs, but also the value of incorporating Stoicism into correctional programs and practices. We also have Santara here, who is the co-founder and executive director of Wisdom Unlocked, and has been administering restorative programs in 10 adult prisons throughout the state of California. Introducing incarcerated men and women to Stoic principles, giving them access to tools and insights. And this is a really important, I think, point here. This is part of her bio, providing them with a sense of agency and allowing them to improve their emotional well-being. So that's something we'll talk about quite a bit. Andy Small is a physical education senior officer who has worked for His Majesty's Prison Service since 1992 in England, and managed physical education delivery at His Majesty's Prison Huntercombe, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, since 2002. Through personal interest, started teaching Stoic philosophy to these prisoners, working towards being personal trainers. So a very interesting emphasis there. and developed an entire course, which was a success, now running in 12 prisons in the UK and in the Falkland Islands. And then finally, we have Rob Colter, a good friend of mine, who is the senior lecturer and head of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Wyoming, the director of Wyoming Pathways from Prison, another great program, and the director of the Wyoming Stoic camp, which we got to spend a little time together this last year, and is also a faculty member of the Stoa Nova. So we've got a great panel. I'm not going to say anything more about myself since Harold already gave me an introduction, other than to say that I myself taught in 3 different departments of corrections over the years in Indiana, North Carolina, and here in Wisconsin. So I've got a bunch of questions lined up, but we'll also take questions from the chat as well. And I encourage our participants to, if you want to take something in a tangent and, ask each other questions, you can certainly do that. Here's the first question. The big theme this year is cosmopolitanism, being part of a community that extends to the entirety of humanity. And that's a really key theme in your work in prison education. Is that a theme that you introduce to your students or you stress with them, and also with your fellow educators when you have to explain what it is that you do, since quite often people have all sorts of crazy ideas about what prison education is? So who wants to jump in and address that one?
I'll jump in if nobody else is super excited to. Cosmopolitanism is, I've been teaching Stoic philosophy for a number of years now to incarcerated populations, and cosmopolitanism is a huge aspect of what we talk about. One of the favorite passages that my students jump on really quick is one that Dr. Rudolph also mentioned. Marcus's Meditations 2:1, right? Where it starts off and says, you're going to meet with all these nasty, ugly, horrible people, right? And usually my students in prison say something like, "Oh, I know that guy," or some of them even, "Oh, I am that guy." But then we get to the latter part of that passage where they talk about how we have to work with them anyway, right? And in this context, these students often recognize, they can't sort of trickle away from each other in ways that students on campus or something like that can too. So the idea that they are in a community, whether they like it or not, most of them don't, at least in my experience, and can try to work together based on these Stoic principles has been really impactful. And the prison administration sees that, and they like that as well. So I'll shut up there.
If I may chime in, and that's exactly the point, is that they are a community, and we stress that. We go into the prisons because they're a part of our community. They're a part of our circles of concern. That's why I'm here. I walk out and have 60 more brothers and sisters at the end of every day because we extend that circle of concern. Especially here in California, you have a lot of gangs in prison, and that's how they tend to divide themselves. But if we look at that, we are all connected by reason, that we are all wanting to build a better character. That kind of connects us. And if we focus that we have more in common than divides us, that tends to bring that circle a little closer. And then also in discussions with correctional officers, because there's another divide. But if we look at what it means to be human and what it means to humanity means in the sense of Stoicism and in our circles of concern, we really stress that the guards become guardians of those, and that we can build that community irregardless of in California, if you are in blue, which is what incarcerated persons wear, or if you were in green, what the correctional officers wear. So I think this idea of cosmopolitan for the work that we do is very crucial and is actually at the crux of what we do.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on Santara's point there. I think that if you understand how corrections departments are supposed to operate, one of the principles of a good corrections department is that we're re-entering people back into the community. So incarcerated people are going to leave and be our neighbors. They're going to live alongside us, whether it's near or far. And if they don't receive the resources they need and the correction they need that's appropriate to them, then we're just not addressing the factors that make crime look like a good idea. So then they return to the community no less likely to commit crimes. So if we look at the big picture, it's in a Socratic sense, it's genuinely irrational to send people to prison and not do the work to return them. So we're all shareholders in human excellence, not just our own. So if it's in our power to influence others to do what's good for them and to improve as human beings, then we really ought to, as appropriate to our roles. So in my view, I always looked at the whole corrective process as sort of being cosmopolitan in nature. We're contributing to humanity practically when we put incarcerated people on the right path.
And to add to what Bob's just said, we focus. So where I work, all the prisoners have got one thing in common: they're not British. So they're from 75 different nations around the world. It's a foreign national-only prison. So all these people have come from all over the world, and they've got one thing in common of not being British. So we have to try and pull them all together. And one of the things that we try to say to them is, I want to think of the Marcus quote when he said, "Imagine yourself moving between the stars." We add things to it like astronauts. So when astronauts go up on the space station, the first thing they realize is that we're actually all brothers and sisters, and we all need to get along to make the best of what we've got. And I think that's the key part of cosmopolitanism. And just a little bit of basic knowledge of evolutionary biology tells us that I think we've got one common ancestor from 60,000 years ago. So we like to tell prisoners all this sort of stuff, and then they suddenly realize how close we are together, not far apart, regardless of our religion and other ethics. So, and I think that's what Stoicism does. No matter if someone's a Muslim or a Christian, it gives us all a common ethics that we can live by, and that's certainly what we do in the prison where I work.
That's all very excellent responses. I do want to say something sort of coming off of what Bob was saying, and this is a little bit more nuts and bolts, not about Stoicism, but it might be interesting for people to hear. So the studies that have been done show that prison education is the most cost-effective way for reducing recidivism, which is people committing crimes and going back to prison. And, we've shifted, at least here in the United States, very much to a punitive model. We're going to lock them up and really punish them hard. And it's quite foolish from a financial point of view, which is what taxpayers are usually interested in, because, so the state of Indiana did a study years and years back. They found that the average with no education in prison was about 66% recidivism, which is quite high. That's 2 out of 3 people are going right back in within 5 years. And they'll do so by not just committing crimes, but actually getting caught for those crimes and then convicted of those crimes. So there's more that are doing things that are not yet getting caught and convicted because they got smarter at that in prison. With a associate's degree, just a 2-year degree, and not in philosophy, just any sort of associate's degree, it dropped to 12%. And with a bachelor's degree, it dropped to 6%. So 11-fold reduction in recidivism. And you can say, well, what went on there? And this is a good lead-in. What is it about prison education that changes the prisoners, the inmates? It's not, a very passive thing where they just sit there and let us do things to them. How do they take, say Stoic philosophy specifically, but philosophy or other things more generally, and use that to change themselves so that they're more likely to reintegrate successfully?
I'll jump in. It's a good question. I mean, what are the mechanisms that are actually working in education to allow people to find that, to dig in and find that opportunity to change? I've thought a lot about that. I think it's a very complicated question. One of the frames that I like to use is Donald Robertson's idea of just cognitive distancing, that what education does is it allows people to basically understand what their own thinking is and to slow down and and to learn to apply different frameworks to their thoughts so that they can actually get in there and start changing them. And if we look at it that way, Stoicism has a lot to offer, because you can essentially teach it straight up and down as a, hey, let's think about our own thinking, slow it down, and then apply some very simple rules. What is up to us, and what should we do? And when you present it that way, it's simple enough that I think at least the population that I taught in New Mexico, which is own unique composition, they really like the simplicity of it, but they recognize the challenge of it and they appreciate it. So you don't dumb it down for them. You don't make it anything other than what it is. It's hard work to be a good person. But once you build out the framework, it's not a mystery to them what change looks like anymore. So when we present education that way, I think it's a little more intuitive to them to see that, oh, this is what the goal is. It's not something that's unattainable. Although I will say we should respect that for people who put in, who've committed crimes. I call it the ethical sunk cost fallacy. They just get stuck in that mind frame of, man, this is going to be a lot. And we need people there to coach them along the way and show them what the goal looks like and how to get there.
I think the public need to have some training. I've been in the prison service way too long, 30 odd years, and people think I'm some sort of old dinosaur and I would just want to flog prisoners. But having done my job for so long, I can tell you absolutely it's the opposite. And we need to train the public to understand that unless we're going to kill all prisoners as soon as they go into prison or keep them in there forever, we need to do something with them. We need to do something which changes the way they view the world. And I think that is the fundamental problem, is they don't know how to view the world. And to add to it, when we talk about rehabilitation, when you think about that word rehabilitate, it means go back to how you were. That's absolutely not what we want to do. I am dealing with people who have been drug dealers since they were 9 years old. So do I want them to go back to drug dealing? No. So it's actually about habilitation. And that's what Stoicism gives us, is that code of ethics, good manners, to actually teach prisoners how to be good people. And we have to, as a practitioner of it, rather than me thinking about this rehabilitation word, I think habilitation, and it feels more gentle to me that society has not done what it should have been. Most of the people that I deal with, they didn't have a father figure, and if they did, he was rubbish. So we have got to then build that up in that period whilst they're in prison, and we must have help somewhere to train the public, to make the public understand the costs to society, to the taxpayer, and the costs in other terms of the absolute carnage that these people cause when they're released from prison. Because we're faced with exactly the same problems as the United States. With, I think they thought it was about £16 billion a year is the cost of reoffending, let alone all the harm they cause. I've said enough. Thank you.
And to piggyback on what Bob said, so prisons are training grounds. So we can do, they're training grounds for getting better at committing crime, or they can be training grounds for becoming a better human being and developing a good, sound character. So education is key in that, because it's a game changer and it provides agency. And when you are incarcerated for, let's say, over 5 years, and you're looking at a long sentence, you really don't feel, at least some of my students, that you have any agency left. You are told when to wake up. You are a number. You are dehumanized. You can't wear what you want to wear. You can't go outside when you want to go outside. So when they come into a classroom and you give them tools, that here are things that are actually in your control, even though you're in an environment where you think you have absolutely no control, something changes. And it's a very empowering thing. And then we take the Stoic philosophy, as Bob said, we don't dumb it down. And then you have students say, I never knew I was smart enough to understand philosophy. I always thought I had to go to college to understand philosophy. And that is the beauty about Stoicism and Stoic philosophy and the way that we can teach it. It's approachable, it's all encompassing, and it has the 4 virtues. And here it is. You lay it out and then you provide that training. But I think that prison education is a key. And we also have to look at, in California, we have a lower recidivism rate amongst incarcerated men and women that have been incarcerated longer. And that has something to do with the value of freedom, right? How they see freedom. And there are other reasons for why people re-offend in the first 3 years after they are released. However, I think education, and especially Stoic education, is a game changer for incarcerated men and women. And that is something that literally drives the work that we do.
Yeah, great points, everybody. I mean, I would just, I guess I would add maybe a couple little things, is that I think all of my students and the program I direct is actually a bachelor's degree granting program here in the Wyoming Department of Corrections. And so they're educated not only in philosophy, tends to be a little philosophy heavy because of who their director is, but education, like in all of these different disciplines and topics and stuff, but in philosophy, I think especially, I think Andy said it changes how they view the world, but I also think it changes how they view themselves. They view themselves in the world in a certain way. And we can start with just that community of students in the classroom, and then they can start to see, the topic of this whole Stoicon, cosmopolitanism, and increasing those, their own picture of themselves as agents in the world. Sometimes it's small and confined, and sometimes I have students who, get put into segregation and things like that, and then it's just them and maybe the corrections officers they deal with, or in the classroom, or they start to see themselves as the roles they play in the whole prison system, or in their families, and so on, right? It's this altering of their orientation of between self and the rest of the universe, right? Philosophy does that, I think, extremely well, but other things can too, sociology, anthropology, literature, all of these subjects are incredibly valuable for that.
So we've already got some good questions coming in the chat, and one of them goes back to something that we'd touched on a little bit. This is from Dave Murray, and I think Stoicism is particularly helpful for this. Do some of these prisoners believe they've gone down a path that they cannot return from? If so, how do you advise them? And obviously, I mean, they're in prison, so they're not, in some respects, coming back from not having done and been convicted of a crime. But, there is that mindset of, well, I'm just stuck. This is the way it is. And it seems like, many, many avenues can be helpful for breaking that mindset. So how do you see Stoicism as figuring into that?
So I'll take a shot. One of the things that I talk about is Epictetus and him having been enslaved. And that at times that may have been for him maybe a fait accompli. I'm never getting out of this. This is it for the rest of my life. And that it doesn't have to be that way. And what does freedom look like, right? Freedom is not a physical manifestation. Freedom can be a state of mind. And that is something that is really hits with the incarcerated men and women that I teach. I work with some that are life without the possibility of parole. However, what I've also seen is that through education and through the self-work on developing their character, I had met one gentleman, he had 7 associate's degrees. He did nothing but continue the work, the philosophy classes, Alcoholics Anonymous classes, Narcotics Anonymous classes. The work with this gentleman did not stop. And this is that mindset that, yes, these are my circumstances, but it doesn't have to define the rest of my life. I can still live a flourishing life in this incarcerated setting, even though I may never see my family outside of those gates again. He didn't know he was a Stoic, right? But that is that perfect Stoic mindset. And I think if we teach in our course of teaching Stoic education, if we remind the incarcerated men and women that we teach that this is not the end all. You can elevate. You can, through the work that you're doing, developing your good character, following the virtues, you can rise above all of this. So I think that's been a really important piece for me to see and to be able to share with my students.
Yeah, so with prisoners that I've worked with over the years, they've been brought up in a life of crime, usually to do with the drug business, and they just think that that's the way that they've got to be forever. But through the work of Epictetus in particular, we can show them the way out of it. And it probably chimes into a bit of this evolutionary biology again. With Daniel Kahneman did some work back in the 90s, I think, and it was about loss aversion. And they posited that we're twice as likely to be to not want negative stuff rather than positive. So if somebody's in even a domestic violence situation, or they're in a drug dealing background and they've ended up in prison, they'll stick with that through fear, because they know they've got fed. They know how to feed themselves through their criminality. So that's what we got to break. And it's breaking the cycle of fear more than anything. And over the years, that's what prisoners have told me that Stoicism has taught them, is not to be fearful, that they've got the skills, they can do it, they can see the world differently, they can see themselves differently and go out and live a good life. And it's fear that stops us. And if we think about us, we're not prisoners, and it's fear that stops us jumping ship and starting a new life or a new relationship. It's usually fear. And that's definitely what the Stoics have taught us. And look at the dichotomy of control. Definitely helps us deal with fear, doesn't it? That we only control certain things, and it's all going to be okay. But once we understand our monkey mind and this fear, we can move past it.
I love that point, Andy. To dovetail with that, I think a lot about what are the incentives for them to have the story in which change isn't on the horizon for them, or what is going on there that's the story that they want to tell themselves. And what I found is that, in my experience, limited of course, is that part of that story is also to keep them okay with the things that they've done, because if they don't need to change, then that stuff was inevitable, and there was no choice in the matter. And as Santara has pointed out, there is that effort to kind of offload agency, that they didn't really have a choice in this. In fact, one of the things I would tell people when they would, when they would ask me, what are prisoners like? And they would say, well, are they always talking about how they're innocent? I would say, no, they actually don't talk about how they're innocent at all. They talk about how they did that stuff. They just weren't responsible for it. And so I think understanding what in the story that they want to tell themselves that makes it okay for them to not change, and then disrupting that story and showing them how, maybe you started selling drugs at 8 years old and you knew no different until you were 25, until you got caught on this murder charge. Well, that's the past. And now that you know what the story is, how can we think about the story in a different way going forward? And what I really want people to understand and appreciate about what is difficult about teaching inmates is that they stare down change, and for a lot of them, that's just a really big push. And we really got to help them see what that looks like practically, or else it just looks like a life of misery, because that means they have to take so much ownership for the horrible things they've done. And to be clear, as we're all advocates for inmates, we do want to be clear that a lot of them have done, and most of them have done, some pretty terrible things, and we need to make sure that they're held accountable for that. But that holding accountable, actually, that's the pathway. If they can take the ownership, they can find a way out through that. It's just gonna suck, to put it bluntly. And we're our job, at least as I saw it, as my job, is there to help them see that, and also to show them that I'm on the same path too. I have to take ownership for a lot of the stupid things I've done in my life. And we're coming alongside each other here. We're not against each other.
There's a question that feeds into quite well, that I think reflects a kind of worry that a lot of people do you have? So this is from Michael. People affected by violent crimes, are they supposed to just forgive? That's the right thing to do, but not easy to implement. I'm not a very forgiving person when it comes to rape, murder, etc. Now I'm trying to be stoic. Not everybody can be reformed. Any advice for newbies like me? And so I'll give you my reflections, and I'm interested to hear what the rest of you have to say. Nobody is saying forgive in the sense of like we go in and we say, well, you look like you're reformed. Now go home. We're all done with your sentence, right? Nobody's saying that these people haven't committed serious crimes. And as Bob was just pointing out, and being able to take accountability for it, that's very important and part of their ultimate moral. I won't even say rehabilitation. I prefer the term reformation, which is something that one does with oneself with the tools that one has. And taking accountability is a central part of that. And even after we say to them, hey, you're becoming a good person, they may still have 45 years to do, depending on what, DOC they're in and what the prosecutor was like that day when they got charged and whether sentences are run together and all of these sorts of things. Not everybody is getting out. And I think so I'll mention this and then I'll shut up because I want to hear from the rest of you. When I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, it was funded by a low-income grant because the Pell Grant had been taken away from prisoners. Now it's back, which is really good. And taxpayers were quite resentful of the fact that, these jailbirds who've committed terrible crimes are getting a free education from Ball State or from the other 11 places. Indiana used to lead the nation in prison education before they got rid of it. And I even had relatives who were not from Indiana who would, at family dinners would get kind of pissy with me and say things like, I had to pay for my kids' education. Why are these people getting a free education? I'd say, it's not even your state. What do you care? You don't have a stake in this. But there was this sense of it's an injustice that we're doing anything good for these people who we, should be suffering. That should be part of what's going on, And nobody, I think we could say this, it's very rare that anybody is going to go into prisons and do things that are going to somehow tilt the scales in favor of letting these people off. Coming in and giving education is not somehow forgiving, right? And letting everything go. Instead, we should be thinking about this, and Seneca talks about this in his discussions on anger about why do we punish in the first place? It's not just to make people hurt in return. It should always be oriented towards thinking about the future for society, but also the future for those people right there who are not irredeemable human beings. Now, granted, there are some people who probably are. That when I was at Indiana State Prison, which is a maximum security, there were some guys in there who had done some pretty terrible things. And, we'd had conversations and they would point out another guy and they'd say, you see that guy over there? He's evil. I don't want him ever to get out because he scares the hell out of me. And I'm a scary guy myself. There's some like that. But those are the outliers. Those are not the average prisoner. And so, what do you say in response to people who are genuinely concerned with, hey, aren't we letting these people off easy for they've done these terrible things and we're rewarding them with education? What's your response to that?
I've got a number of things I could say to that. So there's a lot in there, Greg. So one of the things that I hear repeatedly actually from corrections people in our state is that, first of all, we send these people to prison as punishment, not for punishment. Right? Their being in prison is the punishment. But then something that's already come up is, look, the majority of the people in these prisons are getting out. And you want them to get out better than they were, or the same, or worse, right? And how we treat them while they're in there has a lot to say about what those outcomes look like. And there's other things like you mentioned earlier about the cost of all of this. But, I would say probably, I've probably taught Stoicism to least a couple hundred by now, in a pretty intense level, and probably half of them, maybe. No, probably not quite that many, are in for life, right? Which basically means that they've killed somebody, right? And some of them more than one somebody. And the sorts of things that I see, even in those cases of people who are there for life, and it's not even a question about forgiveness. It's a question about understanding in a certain way, for me, from my perspective, but I also think from some of the students. I'm just going to give a sort of specific story that I've been given permission to share. I'm not going to share names or anything like that, but there's a student I've had a few times now, and he's one of the more notorious people in our state's prison system, and one of the things he got out of this is he'd always been puzzled by or troubled by the idea that he was, every time he goes in front of the parole board and they always turn him down, and everybody wants him to feel bad about what he did. And what he said to me, he goes, "Look, I did what I did, and it's wrong, and I wish I hadn't, and I regret it." On the other hand, there was this part of me that I couldn't get myself to regret or feel bad. And that was that in what I was doing in that moment, I thought I was helping my family. Mm. And if they want me to feel bad for helping my family, I can't get myself to do that. And this was a perfect point to deal with Stoicism, is that, right? One of the things that Stoicism inherits from Socrates is this idea that nobody does wrong willingly, right? That we make mistakes. All of our wrongdoing is from a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge. And what he didn't know, and he says he knows it now, is that what he did and protecting his family weren't the same thing. Conceptually, there's a ways to sort of separate these things, right? So he could understand that he shouldn't feel bad for wanting to protect his family, even if he does feel bad about what he did, right? That these things are sort of separable. And it allowed him, he said, to get sort of get an understanding of the choices that he's made. And he doesn't think he should be forgiven for what he did. But he also doesn't think he needs to be forgiven for wanting to protect his family. Everybody should want to do that. And being able to come to an understanding of himself, his own actions, why he's there in this way, allowed him to recognize how he can take responsibility for his, for what the Stoics would call a moral mistake. At the same time, not requiring him to abandon his care for his family. And so I guess what I want to say is, what are we talking about when we're talking about forgiveness? Right? And I don't think it's pretending that they did something they didn't do, or pretending that they didn't do something wrong. It's a question of understanding why they thought what they were doing was something that they should do. And when we do that, I think we get a much clearer picture, and are in a better position to talk about forgiveness. So
I'd like to chime in on this conversation, because this is something that I bump up against a lot, especially when I speak to people about working in prison, and they look at me as if I've lost it because I'm a female going into a level 4 male prison. One of the things is, and I really want to get this point across, the men and women that I meet when I walk into that yard, when they come into the classroom, are not the men and women that committed the crime that they are incarcerated for. They are in the same physical body, may not even be in the same physical body, but something has happened in between when they committed that crime and the person that I'm sitting across from and having a conversation with. So we tend to meet people where they're at. I never ask someone about the crime they committed. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we are in this space here now. We're going to do some Stoic work, and we're all working on building a better character. And what does that look like for ourselves? And so for us, the question of forgiveness, as was stated, what does that even mean? It's more understanding that the person in front of us is a human being that made a mistake. We've all made mistakes. And that Marcus Aurelius tells us that we should actually feel affection for those that have made mistakes, because that is uniquely human, that we can do that. And we are all 5 minutes away from prison. We are all 5 minutes away from, not responding appropriately to someone that cuts us off in traffic, not responding appropriately to someone who wants to cut in front of us at the checkout counter at the airport, right? So we have to also put ourselves in the shoes of the other person. What we always say is, to see the prisoner inside of us and to see us inside of the incarcerated person standing in front of us. So it is a difficult question when we talk about forgiveness, but what does that really mean? Or are we looking at more understanding the person in front of us, understanding the circumstances around that crime, and seeing how we can move into a space of helping them become the person that they actually want to become through Stoic principles?
To Rob's point, I think that looking at it from the Socratic perspective, that everyone always intends the good, whether they achieve it or not, is extremely helpful for working with incarcerated people. Because if you start from there, then the job is to listen and understand the rationality that led them to making a bad decision that makes sense. And if you don't understand what led them to that decision, then it's actually really hard to get in there and fuss around with what's gone wrong and help them understand it. And in my experience, that the more that you listen, and you also, it takes a lot of Stoic work sometimes to listen to people who've done bad things. I know for me, I don't know how it is for the other people, but the first couple of years I worked in prisons, I was emotionally just drained every single day. As I listened, I started to understand the perspective. And then once I could understand the perspective, then I could actually challenge the perspective and build that rapport to challenge and have them actually accept it. And when I could get there, then I could start seeing some of the empathy start to come for the people that they harmed. And I always approach the work that I did that I'm not a victim of the crime, so it's not really for me to put any standards or rules on what forgiveness looks like. But what I can do for the victims of these crimes is that I can try to work with the incarcerated people so that they can come to understand exactly what they did. And so then if that needs to go further between them and their victim at some point, or between whoever was really directly harmed, then that's between them. But my job is to prepare the ground to try to get them to that point where that's even a possibility.
I think just to add to that, it's not easy. It's not easy for people in prison to actually face up to what they did. And I think the public need to understand that for prisoners to be educated properly and have some Stoic ethics about them, the first thing they've got to do is chuck away this victim mentality that I would say 95% of the prisoners that I've ever dealt with, they're the victims of the situation. It's incredible. And it's probably higher than 95%. I can see you all nodding. So and the general public wouldn't believe it, that somebody's in prison for whatever crime they did. They make out that they are the victim. So with education, with Stoic education, prisoners can actually see, hold on a minute, I've caused this. I'm not in prison because of a snitch or because I was brought up wrong. I'm in prison because I did something wrong. So that's the first part, really, of getting people to understand, that prisoners to understand that they're not necessarily the victim in this situation. Yes, of course, your upbringing may not have been that good, but we call it taking the victim stance, is very debilitating for that prisoner, and we teach them how not to do that, because the public need to understand that what we do is get people to face up with what they did, and then try to make the best of what life they've got left for themselves and for the people they love and for greater society. Getting back to that cosmopolitanism again.
Those are some great observations. And this is a nice segue into another question that Ken raised. And I think this is, really, there's a couple different ways we can go with this. So he writes, here's the question: the mental illness part of prisoners, are some not even able to grasp Stoic concepts? And, we do in the States, and I think, Andy, you can tell if this is the case in Great Britain as well. Just because of the way our society is organized, we have a lot of people with mental illnesses in prisons because, unfortunately, we closed a lot of the institutions down in the 80s, and so we just kind of shuffle them off there. And there's very few good resources for mental health within prisons, with a few exceptions. Usually in level ones for the people who did white collar crime, they've got all sorts of nice things, but everybody else kind of fends for themselves. So Emily actually had a response to that, saying there are probably likely many individuals, including myself, who deal with some mental illness or another and are quite able to grasp Stoic concepts. There could be some outliers who are so badly off that there's really not much that can be done with them. But, I think for most people, they can benefit from any sort of philosophy of life, or some sort of program like AA, where there's also accountability and engaging with other people. It's often framed as if, like, you've got mental illness over here, and this goes right to Andy's point about the victim mentality. Oh, you've got a mental illness, that gets you off the hook. Well, no, you can still work on yourself, despite the fact that perhaps you suffer from things that have resulted from the traumas in your life, right? So where do all of you sit on that? I realize it's not a very well put question the way that I've modified it, but so let's go back to the original one, the mental illness part. Are there some people who just can't grasp Stoic concepts at all? And we'll add to it, those who can. Does mental illness stand in the way of getting Stoicism, or is it something that Stoicism can help out with?
I think can't's a strong word, just because we're working over a continuum of time. So at any one point, if someone's in prison and they're on cooking off methadone and getting high all the time, you gotta treat that need. So if they have a substance use problem, typically what happens what should happen in a correctional environment is you treat them by priority needs. So if someone has a mental health illness that's interrupting their ability to function, then that should get the priority. But that doesn't mean you don't also address some of the other factors. You just have to be sensitive to understanding where someone kind of really is on that continuum. But it's a very complex population. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of substance abuse. There's a lot of just really horrible things in people's past that they're continuing to unpack. My experience is that when I would catch people in my classes, if I thought that there was other stuff going on, you work with a team to kind of pull them off and make sure that gets addressed competently. I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not there to do that. So I've dealt with a little bit of that. But to come back to my point, just the can't is hard, because you can have people, who I worked in prisons for 7 years, and I had officers tell me, that person you're working with, 15 years ago, I couldn't imagine that this person would ever be sitting in a room listening to you, just given the things that they'd said and done and what they were doing. So you kind of get used to just being like, well, anything's possible. You just don't know where you are in that continuum. And so you have to be very objective about it. Hey, this time right now, maybe it's not for me. And so you pass them off to somebody else. Maybe they're not good to have in the room, because I had a student who was schizophrenic who was decompensating in my class. So I had to go talk to an officer and be like, hey, maybe this is not appropriate anymore, because philosophy can sometimes fuel some of that stuff. So it's just understanding where you are and what your limits are, and knowing that some things are better fit for other people, which is just also good Stoic practice to not get out over your skis and try to manage things that really aren't under your control, because then you'll mess things up.
Yeah, I would just add to that. My first response to that sort of question is, mental illness is not being stupid, right? A Do a lot of the students I've had struggle with mental illness or substance abuse problems or massive amounts of trauma? Absolutely. Um, do they struggle to get appropriate treatment and medication in this context sometimes? Absolutely. Um, but I have yet to meet anybody who can't um, understand some of the central ideas of what we talk about in Stoicism. Um, it's not, as they say, rocket surgery, um, but uh, it's certainly not to make some progress. I mean, if you want to start doing Chrysopian modal logic, then okay, sure. But um, for most of us, reading Epictetus, especially if you have somebody who's got some experience with it, is not sort of conceptually off the map for pretty much anybody I've met in this context or any other. So I think, the mental illness question and the whether they can get it question can come apart in most cases. Are there cases where maybe there are people who uh, are in a particular crisis or something where they can't participate in discussion and stuff like that? Absolutely too, right? And that's why this is a we thing, not a me thing, to really start with. Yeah.
There is a mental health crisis in prisons, I guess, across the world. I think 75% of prisoners in UK prisons have had some sort of mental health episodes in the past. But I can say quite categorically, every prisoner that I've come across can gain from Stoic philosophy. If they can listen and understand basic English from a dumb sports coach like me and take something from it, then it's got to be good, isn't it? And that's one of the wonderful things about Stoicism that really that when I was introduced to it was amazing, that you don't need a massive brain to understand it. It's so simple. There's such simple principles. We actually teach it like sports lessons where there's 16 sessions and they're all individual skills. So it's like we just say, right, this is the skill today that we're going to learn. And it makes it so easy for everybody involved. And I've never known prisoners not be able to take to it, unless they don't want to. But even the great Socrates had that problem. So yeah, as long as they're a little bit open-minded, doesn't matter.
Well, as we're drawing to a close, because we only have 8 minutes left, we're going to sort of like leave on a feel-good note. I wanted to know if any of you have some particular success stories about people who have transformed themselves through studying Stoicism, who were inmates that you would want to bring up and, give us examples of what can actually be accomplished.
Yeah, I can jump in if everybody doesn't mind. A guy that was in my prison back in 2017. He was a county lines drug dealer, meaning organised drug crime, introducing children into selling drugs. A Somali guy. He was naughty whilst he was in prison, and he came to us. He got told to come onto the course, and he just took to it like a duck to water. And then when he left prison, he ended up working for an English soccer club. As a crime prevention officer, and then he went on, won an award for them where he was. They showcased him at halftime during one of the matches. He went on to have his own business, and then this year he was in Athens with myself and another former prisoner of where I work, a guy called Boris Becker. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He used to hit tennis balls around a little bit. So those two guys were keynote speakers at a big event in Athens, and Jay, the county lines drug dealing guy from Somalia, is now the role model for people in his community, and he spoke to thousands of young people, teaching them Stoicism, so they don't go down the same path that he went down. And I was immensely proud as an aspiring Stoic could be, to see, well, I guess my protege on stage talking to 120 CEOs from all over the world. So it's really quite remarkable what he did with his life through some basic skills that he learned from the ancient Stoics. So it was incredible.
That is a wonderful story. Does anyone else want to share one?
Yeah, I've got one. The very first class on Stoicism I taught in Wyoming prisons, one of the students in there was he had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at 17. But some of us may know that the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that you can't sentence minors to life without parole. And so he went in for a resentencing, and he was resentenced to 25 to life. Not a big break, maybe, but he was finally released after about 27 years. He was a great student. He'd done a lot to sort of build up the community within the prisons, and had done some even some charity work to help others outside of the prison while he was in there. This is his first several years were not so great, but he sort of turned things around. And then when he was released, he got in touch with me, and one of the first things I did was invite him to my Stoic camp. And he came to the camp with 35 other people out in the mountains of Wyoming, and he didn't really want people to know about his past at first, but then by the end of the week together, I suggested maybe you should tell your story a little bit. And he had talked about how reading Epictetus had sort of changed his whole attitude towards himself and towards the world, and made him more open and accepting of what the universe might bring him. And now he is a successful tattoo artist, and recently did a nice tattoo on me. So he's a great success story. He also spends a lot of time talking to at-risk youth, and talks to talks to classes here on campus pretty regularly about his story, and uses it to help others. So he's a great example, I think.
I don't have any. I have success stories. I don't want to say I don't, but I always really appreciated when I would teach on, say, a Thursday, and I would come in on a Tuesday the following week, and I would have a lesson plan, and things that I wanted to get through for that day, and I had 8 guys come into the room, and they just immediately hit me before they even sit down. They went, "Hey, we were on the yard talking about this last week," and you learn to, if you always judge by the big end goals, sometimes it's really frustrating because you may not know, and people don't get out, and it's hard people get moved around, so you may not be able to track them. But I always appreciated when people would come into my classes and talk about, they were debating about what's really up to us, say, on the yard during rec, and then they want me to kind of give them some, some guidance or some bigger understanding of what it is they're discussing. And I think that if we look at it from those perspectives, there's so many incremental little wins along the way. That I had a guy who had dropped out of the prison gang that I had been having long conversations with just to get a better understanding of how to work with inmates. And he had told me, you're planting seeds. So just keep planting seeds. Just keep having those conversations. Just keep getting them talking. You may not know what the outcomes are going to be, but don't tell yourself you're not having an influence. So I always learned to try to judge it by just the little victories, because I would always get a little bit, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where these people are going to be in 5, 10, 15 years. So I love those big stories too. I wish I had more of them, but I don't. So
I'd like to share one, if I may. When I first started going in to teach, we taught a workshop on the dichotomy of control. It was really important for me to bring this as a first introduction. Here's what we can focus on. Here's what we can control, and here's what we can't, because the prison environment has a very high temperature, and just bumping into someone can lead into a whole yard brawl. So, and this was important for us to impart with our students. And there was one student disengaged. He walked in and said, "Do I get credits for this?" It's a thing in prison, right? If I'm here, I want credits. I want time off, right? So I said, "Well, you actually do get a credit." He hunkered down, kept coming back, but he never said anything. Always sat in the same spot, never said anything. After week 8, I'm like, you can not come back now. You're still going to get the credit. You've passed that point. He kept coming back. And by week 10, he said, "I think I got it." I'm like, okay, I left it at that. Now, the guy who's only there for a credit and thinks he got it, once a month on a Sunday morning holds a Stoic circle for fellow incarcerated men. We got him copies of the Enchiridion, And he starts on page 1, and sometimes 5 guys show up, sometimes 10 guys show up. But that was his version of now. And he's not getting out. He's life without parole. But it's important for him to give back to the men on his yard, basically. So I'm very proud. He went from not getting it to doing it.
Yeah, I think sometimes what we want are the people who really were a hard sell originally, because if they actually buy into it, then that's like proof to others that, yeah, this is not just, getting along to get along, or as you say, getting the credit. Or a big thing for us was time cuts. People would enroll in education in Indiana because they could get a 1 year for a associates and 2 years off for the bachelors. And then about 2 years in, they'd figure it out, and they'd be like, oh, I get these 8 semesters. I better make the best out of them. I've already kind of wasted 4 of them in the past. So yeah, that's an important consideration. Well, this is all great. I'm happy and grateful to all of you for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us, and everybody who's attending. Looks like we have about 150 people on right now. And just to keep us on time, I'm going to just not say anything else and turn it over to Harold, other than let's thank our participants in this panel. And you can, all of them are easy to find online. Some people are asking questions, particularly with Andy, about the 16 step part. So if you want to reach out to these people, you can easily do so. And that's all from us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. This was excellent, and thank you not only for being here today, but for the great work that you do.